Now that we've created our first div, we can explore CSS declarations that allow us to customize the look and positioning of our div. The first item of discussion is CSS IDs. CSS IDs are similar to classes. They are defined in your style sheet and referenced in your HTML elements. The primary difference is that once an ID has been referenced in an HTML element, it cannot be used again within the same HTML file. You might recall that when we created classes, we could use that class as many times as we needed for multiple HTML elements. This is not the case with IDs. IDs are generally used for layout elements that will only be needed once. A great place to use IDs is for defining CSS rules for divs. Divs are considered layout elements because they contain content, such as graphics, text, and media that make up our web page. Each div normally requires its own unique set of attributes. One example is the position attribute. In most cases, when designing CSS layouts, you wouldn't have two divs in the same location on the web page. For this reason, we would need two IDs that define unique position attributes for each div. Let's create a style rule for our div before applying it to the div we created earlier. In order to create a style rule for our div and reference it as an ID, we need to declare it in the style sheet. Let's create our style tags and define the ID. We'll call this ID div1. And when defining an ID, you need to place the number sign in front of the name. This particular ID now contains 4 style definitions. The div will be 80% of the width of our content area. It will have a 3-pixel black border. The background of the div will be yellow, and any text contained in the div will be blue. And we'll also mention again that the style rule for our ID reference begins with a number sign, unlike our classes which began with a period. With our ID created, we can now reference this ID in our div tag. So we'll go ahead and apply the ID here. We need to reference the ID by name, and since we named it div1, we'll plug in div1. Now let's go ahead and save our file and preview it in our web browser to see the final result. So here we can see we have a 3-pixel black border. The background of the div is yellow. The text contained within the div is blue. And the div itself is 80% of the width of the full content area. In addition to referencing an ID in our div tag, we can also create a class and apply it to the div as well. Let's say we wanted all the text in our div to be underlined. Well, first, we need to create the class. So to remember that your class starts off with a period, followed by the class name. And this is the CSS syntax for underlined text. Next, we'll apply this class in our div tag. So just make a space, type class equals, and then in your quotations, put the name of the class, underline. Now we can save our file, preview it again, and we can now see that the class has been applied and all the text within our div is underlined.